This is one of the most haunting criminal cases in modern American memory, not because of gore or spectacle, but because of who stood at the center of it and the unbearable question that followed every headline and every late-night conversation. Why? Her name was Christina Marie Riggs, a 28-year-old nurse in Arkansas, a mother of two whose hands had comforted the dying and steadied the frightened, who had charted vitals in fluorescent corridors and whispered to strangers that they were not alone, and who, in a collapse of spirit that remains difficult to fathom, crossed the line from saving life to taking it. To tell her story well, we have to begin before the sirens and the cold lights in the courtroom, in the quieter rooms where silence presses down and pain hides itself in everyday routines. Christina was born in Oklahoma, raised in a modest household that looked ordinary from the sidewalk. School on weekdays, church on Sundays, parents who worked, appliances that hummed in the evening, the sort of house that tells a passerby everything is fine. Yet behind that front door, she carried wounds that no child should carry. Wounds she later spoke of in careful tones when the recorders were turned on and the questions demanded clarity. As a teenager, she reached for numbing comforts, cigarettes and alcohol, trying to turn down the volume of an ache that followed her into sleep. And at 16, she became pregnant, carried to term, met her child for hours that felt like a lifetime, and placed that baby into the world through adoption, a decision that left a permanent softness around her eyes and an invisible seam down the middle of her days. Still, she pushed forward in the way so many resilient people do, not with speeches or declarations, but with small steps and early alarms and night classes, earning a nursing license, clocking home care shifts, learning the calm cadence that reassures the frightened, becoming the kind of nurse families ask for by name, because she took time to tuck in a blanket and listen to a story that had already been told. In 1991, she became pregnant again, this time with a boy she named Justin, the father gone before the delivery, a recurring emptiness that she absorbed and moved through with stubborn tenderness. And soon after, she met John Riggs, a reserved veteran who seemed like a shore in rough weather, and they married. And a little girl named Shelby arrived with bright eyes and a laugh that could make a tired apartment feel like a holiday. The family moved to Sherwood, Arkansas, close to Christina's mother Carol, and Christina found work at Baptist Hospital, and neighbors described her with words that now feel like fragments under glass. Devoted, soft-spoken, always working, always kind. The person who parked late and left early and waved without telling you what she was carrying inside. The seams began to show in private first, as seams do. Christina saying later that John treated Justin harshly, describing a moment that broke something inside her and nudged her toward divorce. And from that point forward, she was a single mother in the most literal, unspectacular, exhausting sense, stacking shifts, living by a calendar of bills and pickups and lunches and laundry, steadying patients at work and then sitting a moment in the car with her forehead on the steering wheel, letting the quiet hold her up, then shouldering the door open and going inside because there were children to feed and bedtime to make gentle. There is a way the world mistakes competence for safety, a way we assume that someone who keeps moving must be okay, and Christina kept moving, which is why the day everything changed still feels like a trapdoor. On November 4th in 1997, she wrapped a hospital shift in the practiced way people do, with a smile to a colleague, a wave in the hall, a quick note on a chart, and then she lingered a moment where the medicines were kept, and she slipped certain vials into her pocket. Not with the swagger of crime, but with the inward stare of someone who has resolved something. Morphine to soften pain, potassium chloride to stop a heart, and a bottle of Elavil, a strong antidepressant, each item a word in a sentence she had been writing in her head. She drove to her mother's home to collect Justin, 5 years old, and Shelby, not yet 2, and Carol, who knew her girl as only a mother can, watched the exchange with a cold feeling rising under her ribs. A feeling she later put into plain language, that she asked whether Christina was all right and received one of those practiced assurances a tired person gives when they know the truth will open a door they do not have the strength to walk through. Back at the apartment, the evening looked ordinary. Dinner cooked, toys lined up, music from another room, the soft murmur of a mother explaining bedtime rules and a small voice bargaining for one more minute, and neighbors heard laughter and the cadences of a lullaby. And the clock moved in the steady way that has its own awful innocence, because time does not stop simply because it should. Around 9:30, the rituals of bedtime arrived. The smoothing of blankets, the brushing of hair off a forehead, the small kiss that closes the day, and everything on the outside remained gentle, though inside Christina was stepping through a decision that felt to her like the only door left. There are moments in this story we have to approach with respect because their weight is almost beyond words. So let us keep to the facts with a tenderness that does not look away. Around 10, she offered what looked like candy to Justin. And little Shelby wanted the same because little sisters copy the world they love. And what went into their mouths was a crushed antidepressant, strong enough to slow the breathing of an adult. And within minutes, the room grew very quiet. Christina stood at their bedside inside a conflict that language cannot reconcile, a love that wanted to prevent suffering, and a despair that could no longer see a path through. And it is not our task to excuse, only to understand how an overwhelmed mind can turn in on itself until mercy and harm are indistinguishable from the vantage of fear. She prepared a syringe of potassium chloride, the chemical used by the state in executions, and what happened next has been recounted in careful hearings and cold transcripts. And it is enough to say that the plan did not unfold as she imagined in her broken reasoning, and that fear rose, and that she reached for morphine, and that in the chaos of a terrible choice, she completed an act she believed, in that scrambled logic, was sparing her children a harder fate. And then in the stillness that followed, she carried them to her bed and laid them side by side and tucked the blankets as though restoring order could make time reverse. And she kissed them and wrote letters to her mother and her sister and her former husband. Letters that tried to explain the unexplainable, that said she feared her children would be separated after her death, that she did not want them to grow up with the sentence that their mother had taken her own life. And then she attempted to erase herself with medicine and a needle, to end the story where she was, to stop all the clocks at once. She did not die. The next afternoon, Carol felt the dread that had never left her settle into certainty and drove to the apartment and found the door ajar, and the air chemical, and the room too still, and the bed too neat, and the floor a place where a daughter lay barely breathing. And there was a call to emergency, and the professionals who answer such calls came and did their swift routines and moved Christina to Baptist Memorial, where hands she might have worked beside performed the work she had performed for others, a symmetry as painful as it is human. Police searched and found what they needed to understand the sequence, the syringes, the empty bottles, the letters, and the next morning detectives introduced themselves in a hospital room and did the ritual of rites and the formality of a recorder placed near a bed. And within 8 minutes, Christina spoke the truth plainly, without ornament or excuse, that she had done what the evidence already said, that she had believed in that isolated logic that her children would be spared a worse future, that she regretted, yes, but that regret lives downstream of action and does not change a past tense into a present. And by evening, the charges were filed. 2 counts of capital murder, the phrase that sounds like granite. And the news spread with the speed of stories that unsettled the order people hoped for in their towns. The trial in 1998 filled a courtroom that could not hold all the feelings people brought inside. The prosecution described a deliberate plan, a sequence of theft and letters and execution, argued this was not a breakdown, but a choice. And the defense stood up with a different portrait, one of depression so deep it had hollowed out the floor of Christina's life, of childhood trauma, of years of caretaking that never ended, of proximity to tragedy in her work near the Oklahoma City bombing site, a proximity that lodged in the body and never fully left. And doctors used the terms that courtrooms require: severe major depressive disorder, symptoms aligned with post-traumatic stress, just as others use the terms that courtrooms prefer: premeditation, responsibility, intent. The jury heard it all and came back quickly, and the verdict carried the single word guilty, and that word reverberated in the bones of the people who loved Christina and the people who loved Justin and Shelby and the people who watch cases like this to decide what they think about the world. When the court asked for words before sentencing, Christina offered a sentence that made the room colder. She said she did not want to live. She wanted to die. She wanted to be with her babies, and the machinery of what the state calls justice continued forward. And each appeal that could have stretched the time was withdrawn by the person who would have benefited from the delay. A refusal that let the calendar sharpen until there was a date that would not move. May 2nd, 2000 arrived and Christina was taken to the place Arkansas uses to end a life by procedure, the Cummins unit. And in those final hours, there is a tenderness we owe to everyone, because endings are always human. Even when you disagree with the ending itself, there were no visitors, though the option was open. There was a last meal chosen with the ordinary hunger of a person who knows the clock is short. There was a chamber too bright and a search for a vein that took longer than it should have, and Christina lay still with the poise of someone who has emptied herself of struggle. And when the IV was set, she looked toward the glass and spoke a few lines that survive in the stark relief of transcripts and memories. That she was sorry beyond words, that nothing could erase the pain she caused, that she wanted to be with the children she loved. And she said, "I love you, my babies," a sentence that feels like a fragile lamp in a storm. And at 9:28 in the evening, a doctor pronounced her dead at 28 years old. History added two facts that sit beside the case like stones: that she was the first woman executed in Arkansas since the 19th century, and the youngest woman executed in modern United States history. And then the world did what it always does. It divided into camps, some insisting that there are lines that cannot be crossed and that motherhood does not mitigate murder. Others insisting that untreated illness is not an excuse but a context, that despair can become a locked room if no one opens a door in time. And between these two positions, a quieter insight grew among the people who study suffering for a living, that even those who save lives can lose their own when the scaffolding of support is missing or insufficient or too late. In the years since, nurses who remember have sometimes left a white flower at a memorial wall without a note. Just a gesture that acknowledges what language cannot carry. And in Arkansas, there are still people who remember the television glow on those nights, the way the anchor paused before saying certain lines, the way the camera cut to the courthouse steps where the wind made microphones whisper. What remains is a story that refuses to make anyone comfortable, a story that does not ask you to excuse, only to look long enough to see that pain moves through a life in ways that are not always visible, that competence can hide collapse, that a smile can be a shutter pulled over a storm, that love itself can become twisted into harm when a mind is cornered and alone. The Christina Marie Riggs case does not answer the oldest questions about justice and mercy or punishment and prevention. It places those questions in your hands and asks you to sit with them in the quiet after the music fades, to consider what might have changed if certain conversations had happened sooner, if certain resources had been placed within reach, if a tired nurse had been met not only with expectations, but with a net that did not have holes. And it asks you to consider the children lost not as symbols, but as small lives that colored on paper and asked for snacks and liked to be carried from the car when they fell asleep. And to consider their mother not as a monster, but not as a martyr either, rather as a human being whose pain metastasized until it touched everyone around her. When we tell stories like this on a podcast or in a film, we must be careful with our tones and our cuts and our music, because these were real people who laughed in kitchens and left fingerprints on windows and taught stuffed animals to sit at tea. So we keep our lens steady and our voice low and our sentences balanced, and we say what needs saying without lingering on what would turn them into a spectacle. And we finish by acknowledging the only lesson that feels both honest and useful, that the line between mercy and madness narrows when loneliness grows, that communities have the power to widen that line with attention and care, and that sometimes evil does not arise from hatred at all, but from heartbreak so deep it stops the clock and darkens the room and leaves us standing in the doorway years later, still trying to understand. You have been listening to a story that does not resolve easily, a story that begins in a hospital hallway and ends under a bright light, a story that passes through a mother's kitchen and a courtroom where language was asked to hold too much. And if it made you think or pause or feel a little more tender toward the person who looks fine but has been sleeping badly for months, then perhaps a small good has been wrestled from a great sorrow. And if you carry anything away, let it be this: that silence can be the most dangerous symptom, and that asking someone if they are really all right and staying for the answer is a kind of everyday heroism that never makes the news but keeps more homes intact than we will ever know. Every crime begins with a moment, and every rescue does too. And while we cannot rewrite what has been written here, we can choose how we meet the next person at the edge, with patience, with presence, with the belief that a human being's worst day does not have to be the last line of their story.